Hi, it's Dwyer. It is June 29th, 2022. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. There is a very good interview. It's one of the better interviews I've seen by Showtime's Brian Custer, and he's wearing a Kappa Alpha Psi shirt. Let's acknowledge black culture, black fraternity, one of the foremost. He's wearing a Kappa Alpha Psi shirt, and he, of course, is interviewing Danny Garcia, who has been in the ring professionally against Errol Spence, and who fought as an amateur twice. Terrence Crawford, he officially beat Crawford one of the two times, right? Of course, Garcia tells you in the interview, this is how good it is, that Garcia thought he won both fights. So, he's asked point blank, who's going to win? How does he see the fight? Spence against Crawford, one of the biggest fights of the year, right? I would argue, in terms of legacy, since these two guys are both unbeaten, right? The same cannot be said for Golovkin against Canelo. The same cannot be said for Usyk against Joshua. Since both of these guys are unbeaten, an argument can be made that this fight is the biggest fight of the year. So, they ask a guy who himself has been a champion, how does he see the fight playing out? Now, Garcia really helps the viewer here, because rather than pick a side, right, he says, oh, it's going to be a great fight, right? He actually tells you about the guys. Now, I prefer watching fights from home, but you miss a lot. Here, he tells you that Spence is the bigger fighter, right? That Spence, according to Garcia, beat him in their fight. Not with power shots, because Garcia points out that if you look at the punch stat numbers, Garcia lands as many power shots as Spence, but with Spence's jab. In other words, Spence is a big guy. Spence knows how to box. Spence's jab is a big tool in his toolbox, right? Garcia feels he lost that fight because of the jab. This is after Garcia, Brian Custer points out that Garcia said at the time of the fight that he felt he was catching Spence at the right time. Now understand, both Spence and Garcia are with Al Heyman, right? Publicly, people wanted you to believe that the Spence car crash was not a big deal, right? Here's Danny Garcia, boxing insider, guy who's held belts, right? Guy who's had big fights. Here's Danny Garcia telling you that he felt that he was catching Spence at the right time. Custer is the person who mentions it. Danny doesn't disagree. So understand, that Spence car crash was big. But Danny concedes he lost the fight because of Spence's jab. So they ask him, well, tell us about Crawford, right? Compare and contrast Spence and Crawford. And Garcia actually tells you that he feels that Crawford, who's smaller than Spence, is the more talented fighter. Then Garcia corrects himself and calls Crawford the more skilled fighter. Right? Folks, it's a jaw-drop moment, right? And as good interviewers do, Custer just takes it in stride, right? He wants Danny talking. So, of course, Danny goes further. And Danny points out that Crawford, who he calls right-handed, and if that's true, that's a shock to me. That's a shock to me. But Danny points out that Crawford usually fights left-handed, and that he feels that that's going to take away a big part of Spence's game. Because, as Danny puts it, Spence's big advantage is the fact that he's big at welter, right size guy, big at welter, and he's fighting in a southpaw stance that throws a lot of people, and it's not going to throw Terence Crawford. Right? Just remember that. Danny Garcia fought both guys. He feels Crawford is the more talented guy. So, for the gamblers out there, let's raise a possibility. I'll make a formal video on this fight. But let me ask the big question, and it is the big question. And by the way, Garcia calls Spence a great fighter, talks about Spence beating down Ugas in every round. Right? But here's the big question. Do you feel, against a southpaw, Spence is going to be able to land his jab? Right? I believe Crawford takes the jab away from Errol Spence. And once he does that, I believe that Crawford's talent advantage, right, his skill advantage, is going to take center stage. Right? I believe what's going to happen is you're going to have a skill guy up against a guy who's going to have to make his size an issue. And I believe Spence won't be able to. Right? Because at the end of the day, unless you're talking about very different weight classes, right? A welter going up to 168. Unless you're talking about that, at the end of the day, boxing really, for all of its muscle and might, is really a skill sport. The guys at the top are technicians. Even the guys with punches are highly technical. Canelo has great defense, folks. Blessed puncher. Don't get me wrong. But Canelo has great defense, is excellent blocking your shots while he's doling out his, has several punches he can hit you with. I believe there's a skill gap between Crawford and Spence. I believe Danny Garcia is one of the first fighters who's fought both to publicly acknowledge it. Right? I believe that Crawford, in addition to having the talent advantage, is the guy in the ring who simply has different styles he can default to. Right? I want people to revisit Crawford against Kell Brook, who looked finished against him. And understand, Crawford in the middle of that fight against the guy who has faster hand speed and more unpredictability than Errol Spence. In the middle of that fight, Terence Crawford is able to switch stances. Right? He's playing around right-handed, then he switches to lefty. Right? Just understand, that's who Crawford is. That's what Crawford has done against a faster opponent. Right? Let me also say, too, that like Ray Leonard, Crawford is widely misunderstood. When you think of Crawford and Spence, we openly acknowledge, even though, right, guys have gone the distance against Spence. Danny Garcia goes the distance against Errol Spence. Right? Even though guys have gone the distance against Errol Spence, we view Spence in part because of his fight style, which is ferocious. Right? He's coming into the pocket. He's a short-range hooker, not even mid-range. He's up on you, right? Spence looks terrifying in fights like the Chris Algieri fight. We view Spence as a puncher, don't we? We view Crawford as a finesse guy, don't we? Shawn Porter goes the distance with Errol Spence. He does not go the distance with Terrence Crawford. As slick and as ambidextrous as Crawford is a hunter. Crawford is a closer. Right? So Crawford has wanted this fight for a long time. I believe Crawford suspects that he is the more talented fighter. I believe Crawford is highly technical, highly analytical. He understands that if he could avoid the Spence jab, he knows he can match Spence in power shots as Danny Garcia did. And he knows he has a chance, can we say it publicly, to stop Errol Spence. I'll concede, Spence looked magnificent. He looked prime Errol Spence against Ugas. In my opinion, that was one of Spence's best performances. Right? But let's remember there is a moment in that fight, isn't there, where Ugas lands on Spence and Spence pirouettes and literally goes across the ring over to the ropes. For that moment, at least at a minimum, Spence is dazed. And understand, between these two guys, it's Spence who's been in the car crash. It's Spence who has come back from retinal surgery, right? We can talk about whether it's torn or detached. Just understand, an argument can be made, even though Crawford, I believe, is older, that it's Errol Spence who has more wear on the tire. Anyway, the Brian Custer interview of Danny Garcia, and it's one of the best interviews concerning this upcoming fight, Spence Crawford or Crawford Spence, however you want to view it, is in my favorites folder, right? Listen to a guy who has been a champion. Listen to a guy who's been in the ring with both. Listen to a guy who went the distance with Spence and actually beat Crawford once in the amateurs. About the talent levels and styles of both fighters. That's how I see it. Let me hear from you. Again, that Brian Custer wearing a Kappa Alpha size shirt. Folks, you need to pay attention to the clothing, right? The Brian Custer interview, and it's a good one, is in my favorites folder. Let me hear from you. I hope you leave your comments in the comment section of this video. Thanks for stopping by.